At the top of my list of favorite game franchises, there sit two seemingly unlikely companions. One is the first 4 Silent Hill games developed by Konami's internal Team Silent studio. The other is the series of Souls-Borne games created by FromSoftware. If these two franchises are not my number 1 and number 2, respectively, then they're both definitely in my top 3, with maybe Sid Meier's Civilization being the only other real contender for one of those top 3 spots. On the surface, Silent Hill and the Souls-Borne games don't seem to have a lot in common, nor would one necessarily think that they would appeal to overlapping audiences. In some senses, it would seem that they couldn't be further apart. Silent Hill is a series of slow-paced psychological horror games with linear narratives that emphasize puzzles and encourage the player to run away from threats and avoid the game's poorly developed combat mechanics. The Souls-Borne games are frenetic action RPGs that barely have any plot at all, and which are built entirely around combat mechanics, and which are infamous for their difficult gameplay. But despite the radically divergent styles of gameplay that these two franchises offer, they both contain similar themes and are open to similar artistic interpretations, which, by the way, appeal to me at a personal level because of a particular aspect of my core beliefs and identity. You see, I'm an atheist. More specifically, I consider myself to be a strong atheist, an anti-theist, and a secular humanist, among other labels. Not only do I not accept any of the various God claims as being true due to insufficient evidence, I also positively believe and assert with confidence that there are no gods at all because of evidence that they are completely made up. Now, I'm sure that I've just invited a slew of commenters who will try to convert me or share their beliefs for why their personal God is real, but I'm not here to argue about the theology. There's plenty of other places on the internet where you can do that. Besides, I've pretty much heard it all. Not just on the internet, but also from extended family and even some friends. You know, God of the Gaps, personal incredulity, Watchmaker, Pascal's wager, Kalam cosmological argument. I've heard it all, or at least pretty darn close to all of it, and I reject it all. I am as confident in my belief that there is no God as I am in my belief that there is no Santa Claus, and in fact for many of the same reasons. So unless you think that you could convince me that Santa Claus is real, you're probably wasting your time and breath trying to convince me about your personal God. But my atheism also goes a little bit further. I'm also an anti-theist, which means that I believe that religion and religious institutions in particular are also dangerous and do more harm to society than good. And based on my own personal readings of both the Silent Hill and Souls-Borne games, I kind of feel like both of those game franchises agree with me on this particular issue. Before I get into the topic proper, I do want to talk a little bit about the reason for why I decided to talk about this particular topic in order to give you the context for it. Ever since the cancellation of Hideo Kojima's Silent Hills in 2015, following the release of the PT playable teaser, rumors have been swirling about Konami looking for a studio to develop a new Silent Hill game. For a long time, rumors persisted that Kojima's new studio would still somehow be involved, despite the bitter falling out and bridge burning between Hideo and Konami. In spring of 2022, these rumors reached a fever pitch, with the internet believing that an official announcement was imminent. Polls began showing up on Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and other places, asking fans which studio they would most like to see be given the job. And choices typically ranged from Konami getting the old Team Silent back together again, to Kojima Productions, to Bokeh Game Studio, Remedy, Bluepoint, or Bloober Team. Whenever I would see these polls, however, I would always throw out 2 other studios who I preferred. One of them is kind of an easy and almost obvious pick. I don't know how they didn't make it into a lot more of these polls, but it's Frictional Games, the developer of Amnesia and Soma. Like, they're actual horror games. Like, why aren't they right up there with Bloober? Anyway, the other option that I would throw out would oftentimes throw the other fans in these threads for a loop. That developer was FromSoftware. I would often get a response, "Do you want a Silent Hill Souls-like?" No, not at all. But I have long wanted to see FromSoftware try their hand at a genuine horror game. Not just a horror-themed Souls-like, as in the case of Bloodborne, but an honest-to-goodness, pure horror title. FromSoft's games tend to be very rich in a dark, oppressive atmosphere, and the stakes of the gameplay usually creates a genuine fear of what might be around any given corner because death has actual meaning in those games. Furthermore, the Lovecraftian themes and relatively obtuse methods of story delivery help to sell the fear of the unknown in FromSoft's works, which actually lines up fairly closely with the ominously mysterious and unknowable forces that manifest the horrors of Silent Hill. Silent Hill's unknowable evil are more inspired by the psychological horror of Stephen King than by the OG cosmic horror of Lovecraft, but the underlying concepts of dark, uncaring forces beyond human comprehension are still very similar in both franchises. Levels like the Tower of Latria in Demon Souls, the Painted World of Dark Souls, the Hypogean Gowl in Bloodborne, Mibu Village in Sekiro, and so forth manage to capture the slow, methodical, and tension-filled pacing of more traditional horror games like Resident Evil and, yes, Silent Hill. In fact, the Prison of Hope in the Tower of Latria of the original Demon Souls stands as one of my favorite video game levels ever for its incredible, terrifying atmosphere. If FromSoft could take those ideas and expand them into like an entire game, it has the potential to be a genuinely terrifying experience. Several of From's games have also played with light, dark, shadows, fog, and mist in similar ways as horror games like Silent Hill. Heck, Demon Souls even included inventory management systems reminiscent of classic survival horror, including items and equipment that could preserve progress after death. Deciding whether to keep those items on hand and spend them to preserve progress is a decision analogous to the strategy behind using the old ink ribbons in classic Resident Evil. Dark Souls even took it one step further and made such items be a piece of equipment that you have to equip into one of your few equipable slots, with the opportunity cost of not being able to equip something else that has some other benefit. So yes, I think that FromSoftware would be more than capable of pulling off a horror or survival horror game. I've been hoping to see such a game from this studio for quite some time now, and I'm actually kind of disappointed whenever a new announcement comes along and it's just another Souls-like action game. I've loved each and every one of those games, to varying degrees, but I would like to see this studio try something different, and I think horror is right up their alley. I highly doubt that this newly announced Armored Core game is going to satisfy this itch either, so I'm probably going to be stuck continuing to just wait and hope. But more specifically, I honestly do think that FromSoftware could have been a good fit for Silent Hill. Not only have they firmly established their capability to create a horrific atmosphere, but as I'm about to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes explaining, I believe that FromSoft's games actually do have a lot of thematic similarities to the original Silent Hill quadrilogy. First of all, it's no secret that Silent Hill and the Souls-Borne games are heavily inspired by occultism, alchemy, and black magic. But I'm not an expert in occultism, alchemy, or black magic, so I'm not going to go into details about this. If you're curious about how these topics are utilized in these games, then I recommend you check out channels like Max Derrat's channel, as he has posted videos about how both games use these concepts in their stories and world building. It seems clear to me that the writers, designers, and developers at FromSoftware and Konami's old Team Silent studio did a lot of research. They knew what these symbols meant to the people who created and used them. The use, placement, and relations of these symbols in the games isn't just mere coincidence. The meaning behind the symbols is part of the game's stories, and how they are used within those stories conveys part of what the creators were trying to communicate. Just having references to occultism and religious symbols doesn't necessarily mean that the games are automatically critical or opposed to religious ideologies. Of course not. In fact, the use of these symbols could even suggest agreement or reverence for the religious beliefs that created them. But I really don't think that's the case. And the reason that I believe that both FromSoftware and Team Silent don't particularly care for religious institutions is the way in which both studios use these symbols and how they structure their game narratives and frame the religious institutions within. Both franchises have overarching stories that paint religious institutions and religious authorities as dangerous, villainous entities that lie to the mass public for their own selfish endeavors. And before I go any further, massive spoiler warnings for all of the Silent Hill games and all of FromSoftware's Souls-Borne games. In order to talk about how these games relate to my atheism, I need to talk in relatively high detail about their plots and stories, up to and including some late-game revelations. So consider yourselves warned. If you don't want to be spoiled on Silent Hill or Demon Souls or Dark Souls or Bloodborne, stop now, play those games, and come back later. I'm going to start by talking about FromSoftware's games, because they are particularly good about depicting the deceptive nature of religious institutions, because the deceitful nature of the authorities is actually unknown to the player as well, at least initially. So it's easy for an unsuspecting and uncritical player to take the quest given to them at full face value. Rekindle the flame, seek the Elden Ring, drink the pale blood, and cleanse the streets of Yarnum of Beasts. Oh, and, pay no mind to the man behind the curtain.
Now, but don't think too hard about all of this. Just go out and kill a few beasts.
It's easy for a player to go through the entirety of a FromSoft Souls-Borne game and be completely clueless that they've been lied to. Learning about the deceptions always requires the player to stray from the main path, to probe the seams and edges of the world, and to diligently read the descriptions of items that you pick up. Eventually, if you explore enough, read enough, and talk to enough other characters, you may find that things aren't quite adding up. Your quest isn't all that it was made out to be. If you keep probing and keep going to the places that you aren't supposed to be, you will inevitably learn that the powers that be are just using you as a pawn to get what they want. Maybe they're even taking advantage of your naivety as a gamer who just accomplishes the next objective given to you without putting a second thought into it. Or maybe they are taking advantage of your sense of righteousness or justice. After all, you are lulling the old one back to slumber, fighting to cure the curse of undeath, or ending a scourge of beasts, aren't you? Those are all noble causes, right? You're defeating monsters and curses that are causing real harm to people in the game worlds, right? Yeah, that isn't necessarily the case. These quests are deliberate, premeditated deceptions created by the powers that be. They are designed, at least to some degree, to keep the masses in check and to keep them too afraid of threats, both real and imagined, to bother ever questioning the prevailing wisdom. The clerics of Demon Souls, for example, worship a supposedly benevolent god from whom they channel their so-called miracles. They look down upon sorcerers who channel the supposedly demonic soul arts, which they say are derived from the power of the Old One. But guess what? These two beings are actually the same entity. The god worshipped by the clerics is the Old One. Umbasa indeed. The clerics who perform miracles are channeling the power of the same souls consumed by the same Old One as the sorcerers are channeling. Mechanically, this is even represented within the game by the fact that both miracles and sorceries draw upon the same mana bar. Both miracles and sorceries fill the same magic slot, and some advanced items can use either faith or intelligent to perform spells or deal magic damage. And if I really want to be cheeky, I could even point out that FromSoft cast faith and intelligence as if they are in opposition to one another, as if using intelligence to channel the religious dogma is smart and performing miracles using blind faith is dumb. this same dichotomy between faith and intelligence as the scaling influence of magic and spells will continue on into all of FromSoft's fantasy-themed games. Dark Souls is even more explicit about the deceitfulness of the gods and clergy. Your quest is an outright bait-and-switch right from the start. Oscar of Astora tells you that our quest is to lift the undead curse that afflicts humanity by ringing the 2 bells of awakening. But once we've rung those 2 bells and acquired the Lord Vessel from Anor Londo, we're told that this was never our purpose at all. Our actual purpose is to succeed Lord Gwyn by kindling the flame and keep Gwyn's precious Age of Fire going, in defiance of the natural order of the world. Frampt says absolutely nothing about lifting the curse of undeath. Furthermore, the entirety of Anor Londo, the city of the gods, and the very existence of the god Princess Guinevere and her amazing chest is an outright illusion. The gods that you worship aren't real. At least, not anymore. Guinevere has abandoned Anor Londo and Lordran. Gwyndolin, the one maintaining the illusion, is a real, living demigod, sure, but one that is going well out of their way to lie to the player and to hide the truth about Gwyn. As for Gwyn himself, well, he's an empty husk of a god, weak and impotent. And the deception isn't limited to Gwyn, his children, and Frampt either. The other religions that we encounter in the game, like the Way of White, are also depicted as hypocritical and corrupt. I'm honestly a bit unclear as to whether the Way of White is a rival religion, or a schism religion, or just a different sect of the same religion that worships Gwyn. Either way, the Way of White is initially portrayed as a benevolent covenant. Mechanically, it makes it easier for players to find friendly, summonable players in order to help them clear levels and bosses. Lore-wise, they promise that adherents marked with the Dark Sign can be cured with a pilgrimage to Lordran. But in reality, the church is just sacrificing them in order to get rid of undesirables, and possibly also to make a little money on the side. It's analogous to how Christians claim to do good works through charity, but the largest Christian organizations take people's donations and tithes, spend relatively very little of it on actual charity and good works, and then hoard the rest of the wealth for themselves and spend it on political campaigns that are designed to hurt people. One of the followers that we meet, Petrus, is a murderous scoundrel, and he even offers the player the opportunity to prove your faith by giving him a donation of souls, which are the game's de facto currency. You don't prove your faith through your deeds, or through prayer, or through knowledge of the tenets and scriptures of the religion. You prove your faith with a financial contribution. This could just be Petrus being a greedy bastard all on his own, but the rest of the lore within the game hints that the church itself is just as corrupt. And to hammer the point home, the Thurlan Talisman, which is only given to high-ranked members of the Way of White, does not scale with faith at all, implying that the high-ranking leaders of the church don't actually have any faith. They don't believe in the doctrine that they're preaching. In Bloodborne, it is eventually revealed that the same healing blood that is administered by the church is actually causing people's beasthood to begin with. The church presumably poisoned the residents of Old Yharnam in order to sell the old blood as a miracle cure for a plague that they created. They then burnt the whole town and massacred its entire population in order to keep their dirty little secret. The church leadership knew the blood would lead to beasthood, but kept administering it anyway, and created the hunts to clean up and to cover up the messes that they created. The church leadership's desire to transform themselves into godlike beings caused them to do immeasurable harm to both the church's adherents and also to non-believers who just happened to live in the city. And not just Yharnam and Old Yharnam, but also the residents of other places like the fishing hamlet. Before I move on to talking about Silent Hill, I want to remind everyone that if you enjoy this content, you can support its creation by becoming a patron. Patrons receive several perks, including early access to select content. By the time this video releases to the public, the next video should already be available exclusively to patrons. I want to extend my thanks to all of my patrons, past, present, and future. Your support has really helped to offset the costs of my content creation, including the cost of servers for my blog, software licenses for video editing software, research materials, and so forth. So once again, thank you. FromSoftware's religious commentary is admittedly a bit obscured by layers of arcane lore, and it's often locked behind difficult enemy encounters and set pieces. But Silent Hill, on the other hand, is a lot more direct and open about its feelings regarding religious authorities. The religious leaders, Dahlia and Claudia, are outright villains and do such despicable things in the name of their faith. The cult in the game abuses and brainwashes children in order to indoctrinate them at young ages. They even go to the extent of creating a sham orphanage as a front so that they can essentially kidnap other people's children and indoctrinate them into believing that the cult's god can be resurrected. They partner with the local hospital's corrupt director in order to sell addictive narcotics to gullible tourists, and then they spend that money to build their churches, run their sham orphanage, and also to bribe the local authorities so that they'll look the other way. And that's just the institutional evils and corruption. That says nothing about the individual evils that the religious figures in Silent Hill will do in the name of their beliefs. We can start with Dahlia's shit parenting. She neglects her daughter and robs her of her childhood, and when she finally does take an interest in her daughter, it's only because she comes to some realization that she could potentially use her daughter's psychic powers to achieve her goal of resurrecting God. This, of course, requires sacrificing her daughter's life. You know, kinda like Abraham having to sacrifice his son in Jewish tradition. After the cult's plans are thwarted by Harry in the first game, what does the cult do? Well, they do what every religion does. They rewrite history and retcon their own belief system. And those who challenge the leadership are excommunicated, exiled, or killed. In the case of Leonard, Claudia even has him admitted to a mental institution in order to silence him, to unify the church, and to prevent the followers from splintering into different sects. She also murders Harry, partly so that he can't protect Heather anymore, and also partly as revenge for him having killed God in the first game. But also because she believes that her God is born out of hate and suffering, and she must instill those emotions into Heather. And then of course there's the metaphorical story of Silent Hill 3 in particular. That game can be read as an extended allegory for the religious right's denial of women's reproductive rights. I've already talked about this in a previous video, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but in summary, Silent Hill 3's plot can be described as being about a religious fundamentalist trying to force a teenage girl to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term, against her will. Claudia is the villain, and Heather's fetus is presented as a literal demon. The whole game is loaded with symbols and metaphors of femininity, menstruation, pregnancy, birth, and abortion. And Silent Hill's critiques of religion isn't limited to just crazy cults either. Team Silent took some stabs at mainstream Christianity as well, most notably in Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 contains at least one reference to minority groups being persecuted by the Christians who were in the majority. It's a lot more subtle and understated here, but it is there, and it condemns Christians just as much as it condemns cultists like Dahlia, Claudia, and Vincent. In the past, on my blog, I've advocated for new Silent Hill games to stop focusing on Twilight Zone-esque stories about repressed guilt, and for them to return to fleshing out and expanding the occult influences of the original games. It isn't that the cult storylines of the original 4 Silent Hill games connect with me per se, it's more that those cult storylines are part of the game's broader anti-religious themes. Corruption of church officials, worship of evil beings, indoctrination and abuse of children, control of women's bodily autonomy, persecution of non-believers, historic revisionism, and so forth are all recurring themes or ideas in those games. As a budding atheist making sense of my identity, those themes spoke to me in a way that very few, if any, other games did at the time, and which very few games have done since. The Silent Hill games, with their more obvious anti-religious messages, came out when I was a teenager, at a very formative and impressionable time in my life. I possibly, subconsciously, gravitated towards these games because of those themes, and those themes surely influenced and reinforced my own dislike for religion. They weren't the only influences, of course. I was also raised a lot on Star Trek, the next generation in particular. Star Trek glorifies the use of rationality to solve problems and to better our lives. It also exposes religious belief as auto-deceptive and religious leaders as manipulative, power-hungry opportunists who use people's legitimate faith and trust to get what they want, even when it conflicts with the legitimate believer's best interests. By the time of the release of Demon's Souls, my atheism was firmly cemented as a core part of my belief systems and identity. I had spent hours upon hours reading and listening to apologetics and their associated debunks. The backlog of Atheist Experience episodes and YouTube content creators like R and Raw were immensely helpful. So when games like Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and Bloodborne were released, I picked up on the religious themes, no matter how subtle they might have been. I noticed when the churches of these various games exercised deception and corruption, when they indoctrinated people in false beliefs, and when they revised history to hide information that conflicted with their so-called truths, when they would appear to persecute minorities, and so forth. And I would immediately see them as the villains that they are. All of From's games are basically about powerful religious institutions outright lying to the mass public in order to preserve their corrupt and ultimately destructive power and influence. In some cases, it is to maintain their personal power and authority. In other cases, it is a more abstract desire to keep the world the way that they want it to be, even if what they want goes against the natural order and the organic evolution of society. In Silent Hill and FromSoft's games, religion is a corrupting influence that gives evil people an excuse to be evil in ways that society just kind of accepts. That societal power that the religious position offers them enables them to inflict their evils upon others. Their religious beliefs and convictions come from misunderstandings of natural, or in the case of these video games, supernatural, phenomenon, and they project their own biases and prejudices on the outside world. In the case of Silent Hill in particular, they aren't just projecting internal prejudices in the form of regressive laws and public policy, but the supernatural powers of the town of Silent Hill allows these prejudices to physically manifest in reality as places and as monsters.
They look like monsters to you.
This depiction of religious authorities in Silent Hill largely lines up with my own perceptions of real-life religious authorities, and serves as a warning against giving such people any political or cultural power. The later Silent Hill games, especially Shattered Memories and Downpour, neglect the cult-focused stories and lore of the Konami-developed games, and so they lack those strong anti-theist or anti-religion themes and messages. I guess Homecoming and Origins have them to an extent, but those themes are treated much differently in those games, and both those games are also just bad games, or at least bad adaptations of Silent Hill, for many other reasons. To me, the gradual distancing from the anti-religious themes as the games have gone on felt kind of like a betrayal, and is a big part of why I personally don't like any of the games after Silent Hill 4. Those anti-religious themes of the original games, whether they were intended by the creators or not, became a core part of the message of those games, for me, and a core part of the entire franchise and lore that was built around them. Taking those themes away made the games not feel like Silent Hill anymore, at least not to me. The new games just don't connect with me the same way that the old games did, and I hope that the new batch of Silent Hill games that Konami's going to be releasing in the coming years will go back to telling stories more akin to what the original 4 games were telling, and not just focusing on some protagonist's repressed inner guilt over some crime that they may or may not have committed in the past. FromSoftware, on the other hand, has basically just been telling and retelling the same stories about lying religious orders in every single game that they've released. So, the Souls-Borne games have basically picked up the mantle that Silent Hill abandoned as being my personal favorite game series that challenges religious orthodoxy. And so, I'm still a loyal fan. Thanks for watching.